John, do you have any parting words of wisdom?
I have no wisdom.
The wisest thing he said all day. He looks like Gandalf, but he speaks like Jeff Foxworthy.
No. Really? Jeez.
No, that was rude. I take that back. I'm sorry. Eric, you can cut that out in the final edit. That's not right.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
All right. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is Not Church. My name is Nat Turney. I am here, as always, with my brother, John. Say hello, John.
Hello, John.
I was going to be clever and say something other than hello or hola, and I could not think of another language to say that. Say, never mind. I'm just going to stop there. We are here today with an amazing guest. John, you feel like I do sometimes. We just have gotten so fortunate with the caliber of people who have agreed to come on the podcast. It's just great. I hope I never get tired of saying that. So far, I'm still flabbergasted when they say yes. But today, we are going to have a chance to talk to Dr. Christena Cleveland. Let me read you a little bit about her, which will in no way, shape, or form couldn't come close to possibly covering everything you need to know about her, but it'll give us a good jumping off point. So, Christena Cleveland Ph.D. is a social psychologist, a public theologian, author, and activist. She is the founder and director of the Center for Justice and Renewal, as well as its sister organization, Sacred Folk, which creates resources to stimulate people's spiritual imaginations and support their journeys toward liberation. A weaver of Black liberation and the sacred feminine, Dr. Cleveland integrates psychology, theology, storytelling, and art to stimulate our spiritual imaginations. She recently completed her third full-length book, God is a Black Woman, on HarperOne, which details her 400-mile walking pilgrimage across central France in search of ancient Black Madonna statues and examines the relationship among race, gender, and cultural perceptions of the divine. Dr. Cleveland holds a Ph.D. in social psychology from the University of California, Santa Barbara, as well as an honorary doctorate from the Virginia Theological Seminary. An award-winning researcher and author, Christena is a Ford Foundation Fellow who has held faculty positions at several institutions of higher education, most recently at Duke University's Divinity School, where she led a research team investigating self-compassion as a buffer to racial stress. Though Dr. Cleveland loves scholarly inquiry, she is also a student of embodied wisdom. She recently completed the Art and Social Change Intensive Body Wisdom Training for Millennial Leaders and is currently deepening her mind-body-spirit integration in a year-long life practice program for BIPOC. A bona fide tea-snob, this is important, by the way, lover of Black art, and what in the world? Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Oliver Arnolds.
Thank you for rescuing me. I was reading that going, I was doing so well up to that point. Oliver Arnolds.
Which, by the way, it was such an interesting thing that I had to look him up and listen to some of his music. And it's good. I like it.
All right. Well, Christena so she's in Boston, by the way. So we might just have to start with Oliver Arnold. Oh my goodness. Is this person still living?
He is. He's like 35.
And so I'm butchering this guy. I'm butchering this person's name, and he's going to, please, if you hear this, I'm sorry. I hate messing people's names up.
A lot of people do because he's Icelandic. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, he's Icelandic, then I'm less worried. So, I'm kidding. My wife actually lived in Iceland when she was a kid, so she might know who he is. So anyway,
Icelandic people aren't really. He's not going to come for you. Like Icelandic people aren't like that. Like,
these are the Vikings, after all. They're
I think they were like something happened in the evolutionary cycle of Vikings because they're just very gentle, chill people.
Yes.
So anyways.
I was very nearly proud of myself for getting through most of that bio without stumbling, and then I just fell off the rails at the end. So all of that to say, obviously a very accomplished woman, a very accomplished person who couldn't be more than about 20, 25 years old. So it's amazing you've packed so much living into such a short amount of time.
Yeah, definitely.
Welcome to the podcast. We're so glad you're here. Would you do us a favor, if you don't mind, if you're comfortable, just sort of give us a little idea of your faith background, kind of maybe where you've come from, maybe the journey that you're on in terms of faith.
Sure. And just for your listeners who might not know me, I am not a savant. I'm 41. So I'm not 25. Don't want to misrepresent myself.
As someone who's in his 50s, 41 still seems really young.
Yeah.
Goodness. So
I grew up in California in the Bay Area, grew up in a Black Pentecostal home. I learned when I was faculty at Duke that my family is Black Pentecostal royalty. I sort of knew that, but wasn't really but I have very prominent ancestors in the Black Kojic Church, which is Church of God in Christ. But despite the fact that I grew up in a Black Pentecostal home and spent a lot of time in Black Pentecostal spaces, I don't think there's anyone on the planet who has more evangelical street cred than I do. It's quite scary, actually. I did Awana, which is like a Baptist thing.
Oh, yeah.
Baptist program. I graduated through all of that. I did Missionettes, which is like Girl Scouts in the Assemblies of God Church. I did YWAM. Oh, wow. I taught at Westmont College, which is an evangelical college. So as I look back on it, I was very much shaped by the evangelical church while also being in these Black spaces, which is probably why I'm such a mess now. The other day, I was just thinking, why does it feel like my whole life is about healing? Well, when you go back to the cult-like spiritual spaces that I was in, because in the Black Pentecostal spaces theologically were essentially evangelical, even though there was a lot more shouting and a lot more spirit, which actually I'm grateful for. It was definitely more interesting than like a Baptist church or something. And I think that what I carry forward from that is just an interest in the world of the spirit. I was listening to a podcast today and they kept saying, and the more than human beings that are around us. And that just makes sense to me because of those Pentecostal roots where it's like we would show up at church and be like, God's going to do something.
Right.
And it'll be interesting and it'll be surprising. And we're not going to just go by a liturgy or we're not going to just go by rote, That said, theologically, it was pretty it was very holiness tradition. So separation, we got the save yourself for marriage, the purity conversations. We got the it's important to memorize scripture. It doesn't really matter whether you agree with that scripture. The important point is to memorize it. And a lot of that just hierarchical top-down leadership, spiritual leadership, which maybe that's why I felt so comfortable in these white evangelical spaces, is because essentially the theology was the same, except for the Pentecostal part.
Right.
And so I was raised in a home where my parents are pastors. Everyone in my family is basically a minister. And so church was our whole life. And we weren't allowed to play soccer because soccer conflicted with church and, just stuff like that. I've never been trick-or-treating. We spent every New Year's Eve at church at watch night services. That's more of a Black church tradition. But we would ring in the new year at church at an all-night prayer meeting. And that was supposed to be fun. I just remember my parents kept trying to tell us, this is the best, this is the best place you could possibly be. And even as a 7-year-old, I was like, I doubt that, I was not worldly at all and had no idea what actually went on New Year's Eve, but somehow I knew that I was already being just swindled, basically. So that's that's how I grew up. I grew up in this, my family home was strict. My parents were, I called them friendly dictators. As long as we went along with what they said, they were actually pretty great. But any act of defiance, and defiance could be just a question. I don't understand, or, and that would often, I learned very quickly that's not to be tolerated. My parents they're very, their leadership style is quite hierarchical, still is to this day. And so they often intentionally adopted God's voice. And they would say, God told us this. So it's not that I transferred my relationship to my parents onto God. They were we are basically God. So right. it was looking back, I realize now oh, wow, there was some spiritual abuse there in the way that they were acting on behalf of God, in a way that overrode my innate spiritual wisdom and didn't make space for that. It was a way to control.
That was one of those things that John and I both grew up in, what we like to call Pentecostal light churches.
Like Vineyard or something, Foursquare.
Like Foursquare. Foursquare is very Pentecostal light.
Yeah, Pentecostalism for white suburbanites.
Right, exactly right. Yeah, it's all of those the woo-woo spiritual experiences, but on the down low. We certainly preached about it. We talked about it.
And make it kind of safe. Don't leave people out too much. Yeah. Don't act like you're poor. Don't act like poor people do. Don't act desperate.
Right. Yeah. We're supposed to be, there was all of that was couched in very subtle language of like, well, God likes order in church. And so that's how we could sort of, throw shade on the people that went too far with it. But we still theologically agreed with everything they were doing, right? So the speaking in tongues stuff was fine. Obviously supernatural healing, all that stuff. But we didn't want that on display on Sunday morning because then we'd be too weird. But it was one of those things that eventually began to really rub me the wrong way, was that notion, that knack that they had for speaking in the voice of God. So the people who worked in the quote unquote prophetic would always, they would occasionally stand up and prophesy in church. It was always, the Lord saith. And I'm like, who, really? And even as, like you said, even as that 8 or 10-year-old, I'm like, this doesn't make sense, because I just don't think it works like that. But I did see that similarity between those kinds of experiences, right? That sort of bleeding over with like the supernatural, but also can become very rigid and very authoritarian. Very,
very. And there's not a lot of space made for cultivating one's own connection to one's inner truth. It's always, the authority is always outside of you. That was really hard to disentangle as I got. It was amazing as an adult. My dad, I remember I was like in my early to mid 30s. I'm a professor at Duke and my dad calls me, right? So like out in the world, like I'm seen as someone who knows their mind, is a leader. Like, and my dad calls me up and says, God has given us a way for all of us to have enough money. Cause like typical Pentecostals, my parents are very like, retirement account, what? Like God will provide, so. Right. Totally, right? God. Like, I don't think they got healthcare until like Obamacare mandated it, just like that kind of stuff. Right. And they were always just like, we'll just pray and God will heal us, and some of that I really respect. And some of it I'm like, okay, but it's not a bad idea to have healthcare too,
Right.
But he called us. So, he's like, God found a way for us. And it was like, he said, I want you all to sign up. And it was like a multi-level marketing thing that someone was talking about, right?
Oh,
and so I just remember, and he literally said, like, this is how God's going to provide for our family. And I remember going to my therapist and being like, I really don't want to do this thing. Like, I really don't want to do this thing. But there's something in me that still feels like I'm going to miss out on God if I don't listen,
Right.
And just realizing, gosh, I'm 35 years old. And in my head, I completely disagree with this, and I can even analyze why I disagree with it. But at the end of the day, like I'm having trouble sleeping because I'm afraid that God's really going to withhold something from me. And that's when I was just like, what kind of, like, who is this God?
Right. Yeah.
It's like terrorizing me. Yeah. It's just interesting how much the authority is just outside of you.
Yeah. And that was always, it seemed to me, when I got farther away from it and got a little objectivity, I was like, wow, what a really good way to have your word never be questioned. If you can say it's God, well, how I guess I can't argue with that. I mean, God said, therefore. And so when you get beyond that, you see how manipulative that is.
Totally.
And it's totally spiritually abusive. And we actually had pastors that I worked for who were involved in MLMs that would try to sell them at church and try to get, so then there you have your authority as the anointed man or woman of God saying, by the way, buy these nutrition bars and sell them to your friends. And all of a sudden we'll all be rich. I'm not joking, John. It was the weirdest, dude. It was like,
I've seen it. Yeah.
Phone cards, electricity plans. It was anything you could think of.
Random vitamins that are unregulated.
Yeah. Vitamin supplements. And like don't go to doctors. We can just sell you this stuff. And by the way, you'll get rich and healed. But yeah, it was bonkers.
Well, and then they're completely covered because if you as an individual fail at doing this, you just lacked faith.
Yeah, it's on you.
It's a prosperity gospel thing. You weren't holy enough. You weren't good enough. Right. Yeah.
You have some secret sin in your life.
Yeah, right? Exactly. That you need to, like, in this really gross and abusive, vulnerable way, share with everyone, even though they've done nothing to establish safety or covenant in that space.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Oh my gosh.
Like, even the altar call, like to go back and look at the altar call and like seeing how like lopsided the vulnerability is of people having to go up in front of the entire, and like we just saw that as normal. Like that's what it means to be faithful. And now I'm like, no, that's what it means to be vulnerable without at all checking out whether the space is safe.
Right.
Like, this is like the opposite of self-care.
It's very, very triggering. This whole conversation so far is very triggering.
Yeah. But you know
Taking me
what's
back.
so interesting about that is like, I've noticed, because my first book was on divisions in churches. So I've worked in so many divinity schools. So I've spent a lot of time in spaces outside those kind of like Pentecostal light spaces. And, in the more conservative spaces, they do the same thing, but they just do it through interpretation of scripture. So in these like expository sermons, they're like, well, this is just the word. But I'm like, no, that's your interpretation of the word. But they still use that same like power over, you can't question what I'm saying because I'm just preaching from the word.
Yeah. And they'll almost never admit they're doing any sort of interpretive work, right?
Zero. Yeah.
Oh, listen, it's in black and white right there. The Bible says it. I believe it. Yeah. We've had to struggle against that quite a bit. Just leaving fundamentalism at all means shedding that kind of inability or lack of awareness, a lot of lack of self-awareness that they don't even realize they have an interpretive lens. And like, of course you do. The Bible doesn't say anything. You read it, you interpret it. Sometimes you get it right. Sometimes you get it wrong. And sometimes it's wrong. Oh my gosh. What a shocking idea. And
we really, at least in terms of Jesus's words, we really have no idea what Jesus actually said because it was translated immediately into Greek.
Right. Well,
and so like, we don't even,
most biblical scholars would argue that those things weren't even documented until years and years and years later anyway. So God knows what.
Yeah, there were a bunch of women sitting around a fire, passing along what these words were, it was alive in the people, but not in any sort of scholarship or, yeah.
Yeah. And then we conveniently wrote the women out of the story. So that's nice. So we can talk about that in a
Uh-huh.
little bit when we didn't just whitewash, we also gender washed, we changed names and by we, I didn't do it, but
your ancestors.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't, we sort of tongue in cheek said it, but it's true, first of all.
Yeah.
And we have to be, as objective as possible when looking at this stuff and saying, can't imagine there were not agendas that people were pursuing and pushing. So, but all of that is interesting. Let's talk about the book though. So a 400-mile walking journey across central France. You've already got me hooked just on that premise alone. It sounds a little bit like the Camino that people take from that part of France across Spain, right? So it's that sort of pilgrimage.
Totally.
So, how did that come about? And tell us whatever you'd like to about that process.
I was just desperate, I was still at Duke. I think I first started really awakening around the question of God, the God that had been handed down to me. I don't know. I guess officially probably around when Trayvon Martin was shot and killed, because so about 10 years ago, because I was really involved in, back then it was called reconciliation work in the church. And I was, on the front lines of talking about race within the context of the church. And I was just shocked. It was really like a heartbreak when I saw how white people in general were responding to, the like non-indictment. I guess he was indicted, but the non-guilty verdict of George Zimmerman, and just that divide. Like this, it was kind of the first time in my adult life where there was a national conversation happening about race, and I just saw these so-called friends, these so-called family members, in white church spaces who just like absolutely could not see Black people's perspective on it, and were like triggered by it, and like just kind of like could not handle the ambiguity of maybe I'm seeing the world a way that's really different than everyone else. And it was quite violent. So that was kind of like my first mass firing of white friends in the church. And then I kept doing that work, but it really wasn't until when Trump got elected that when Trump was running to be elected, because when he started saying racist and xenophobic things, I was kind of like, well, of course, white Christians aren't going to care about that. White Christians are racist. I know this. I've been doing this work for like 6 years at this point. They don't care. But then when he started talking about white women and assaulting white women, I was like, okay, finally, white femininity is like a fruit of the spirit, like it's so treasured. It's like, and as a Black woman in those spaces, I've seen it used against me so many times that I was just like, surely they're going to care about their precious white women, like finally he's going to violate something that matters to them. And then when I saw them like apologize and explain away Trump with that, I was like, we're all fucked. Like all of us.
Yeah.
All of
like
us. Yeah.
Nothing is holy to these people. Nothing.
No, nothing.
Just
You're
power.
Right. Yeah.
Like, and so that's when I was like, we need to, because up until that point, I'd really just been interrogating God, like the Christian God's race, you know, and I had written a lot about the Black Christ and blah, 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 this and that. But at that point, I was like, Christ can't be male anymore, too. Like, we need to just, so that's when I just started, like, I was just desperate. I was like disillusioned. I was sad. And I just started looking for images of the divine. It wasn't that quick because there was definitely like a liminal space for a while there. But, you know, once I was ready, I was like, let me see if there's something else out there. And that's when I immediately got connected to the Black Madonna. I saw one image of a Black Madonna in a book and it like completely my entire body just melted. And I realized I had been holding in like every muscle of my body out of fear. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like this affirms every question I've ever had since I was a little kid, like about why all of this is happening in these spaces. And so that's when, you know, I'd done like a year and a half maybe of just research on the Black Madonna, but I just was like, I really want to go see her. So I did some research and I found that this particular region of France just it's really old. That the central city, Clermont, is the first mention of it is like 100 BCE, but
wow.
It's probably like a good 1,500 to 2,000 years older than that. But that's like the first like historical reference we have of it. So like pre-Roman people have lived there. And so it's really old. And the reason why there's so many Black Madonnas in this region is because it's kind of like a witchy, magical region. There's all these volcanic rocks, all these volcanic mountains. It's surrounded by a chain of like 40 something volcanic mountains. So, and wherever you see volcanic mountains, there's always like tons of goddess worship and like just people being like really interested in the earth and what's happening. So there are all these sacred sites that were like Isis or Black Artemis or like Demeter, you know, these like ancient Black goddesses. And then the Catholic Church came and just built Catholic churches on top of them. And so now they're Black Madonna sites, but they're these like just really ancient, like way deeper than anything that Christianity or Catholicism could even begin to try to claim. And so I just went there and was like, I'm just going to just start walking to these. So I didn't have a plan. I don't know any French. I didn't know anybody. I was just like, I had a backpack and was desperate and was just like, I'm just going to start walking to as many of them as I can. And so I walked to 18 that first pilgrimage, and it was a little over 400 miles. But yeah, it was just, and I think that's where some of that Pentecostalism came in handy, because I was between Pentecostalism and Black liberation theology, I think I was able to walk up to these Black Madonnas and just be like, all right, something's going to happen here. And my spiritual imagination can carry me. It doesn't matter that you're not mentioned in scripture. It doesn't matter that like none of my colleagues at Duke would even substantiate any of this. I have some sense that there is a being or essence out there that can relate to my experience as a Black woman. And that essence will show up in a way that makes sense to me. And so I just went up to each one and just had these like experiences. My wishy friends say that I was manifesting or like, you know, casting spells, you know, like I think in that language, like, you know, like, cause I've gotten to know like friends and covens and whatnot, like, you know, it's like, yeah, that's kind of how like spells work. It's intention, intention and expectation and imagination. And I was like, okay, cool. Then I guess that's what I did. I cast some spells.
Well, yeah. And there's there's something to be said for being present. Right. And just, I mean, there's a lot of, that's one of those things that I do think if you take away some of the spiritual trappings of Pentecostalism, I think they're right about some of that. Some of it is just about showing up and having some expectation that something will happen. And
some of the embodiment too.
Yeah. But it could also just be that as you're expecting, you're just more aware of things you might have just passed over otherwise. And so I've tried to see that in sort of the day-to-day of my own life. Try to be present, try to be aware, try to see those things that maybe just sneak past you when you're otherwise distracted. And I do, first of all, your writing is brilliant. I was like John. I had a hard time putting the book down. It's paced really well. Your storytelling is gripping. So I don't want to give away any of your stories except for the one where you thought you were going to get arrested, which I just think is just a brilliant way to open that book. I just like, if you want to grab someone's attention, grab it that way. I
still haven't gone back to that village either. I mean, I'm pretty sure, I'm pretty sure, I've gone back. I went back and visited, because I was in France for 3 months in late 2021 and basically until my book launched in February. And I went back to most of them, but that I'm like, I can't go back to Aurillac. Like, I still think that they're going to be looking for me.
There may be some like hand-drawn wanted poster.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like the French version. Oh my gosh.
Just stay out of the post office. You'll be okay.
Yeah. And I'm like so easy to spot in these like remote French villages, being black and like.
Right. Yeah, if this happened in Paris, you can blend, right? No problem.
Pretty much, yeah. But between my skin and the fact that I don't speak any French, in this region of France, like nobody speaks English because it's rural, it's not Paris, And so, oh man.
As we joke about it, that what struck me though was that visceral need to get close to that statue, which just allows you to throw caution to the wind. Say, doesn't matter what the repercussions of this are. I just need to touch her.
Yeah. And also just like the larger metaphor of like literally every step I took towards what I now call the sacred Black feminine was like cause for arrest in my spiritual communities of origin. Like all the forces of authority in my spiritual communities of origin felt violated by my journey and were out for my arrest. And it showed up in other ways, not in sort of the judicial system, but it showed up in like speaking engagements drying up and like people excommunicating me. And so it's interesting just how policed my Black female body was in the States before I even came to France and then was policed.
Well, and you I think brilliant, you used the word fugitive, which immediately strikes a chord with me. I remember we had a gentleman by the name of Bayo Okomalafe on the podcast a little while back, and he uses that term pretty liberally to talk about fugitive spaces and disruptive things. So when you pulled that into your experience, said something about being a fugitive even at the age of 5, that struck me. Can you expand on what you mean by that? Yeah,
we were always in these white evangelical spaces in ways that I think even now my parents would say, gosh, that was violent. Sorry, we put you in those spaces. They weren't thinking it, but they weren't as aware as they are now. The first time I was called a nigger to my face was at a vacation Bible school at a church in our town. And the teacher just got mad at me and my brother because we didn't hear her when she called us back to class. And during the recess, and she just like, get in here, you niggers. And I just remember as a kid being like, I don't know what that word is, but I know it's not good, and of course, when I came home and told my mom, she was livid and, she explained more. But in the moment, I knew it has something to do with my Blackness because me and my brother are the only brown kids and this whole sea of white kids at this like super boring VBS. And that's the difference is our skin color. I knew it. So just kind of noticing how anytime I was in these spaces, and they're not just white evangelical spaces, I learned in broader spaces in the world that, anytime I show up in my Black femaleness, I'm seen as unsafe, problematic. I'm punished for just being me. And so I saw that, at that BBS when I was a kid, but also in the beginning of the book, I talk about giving a lecture at Cambridge University and, just critiquing a white male scholar's work and through a kind of a critical race lens. And then this random man in the audience just saying, I can't tell if you're sloppy or mischievous. That's the first question that comes at me, which is just not an academic question,
right?
not even a question. And I've been in academia for pretty much all my life, and so I'm happy to entertain real critiques of my talk. And it wasn't a perfect talk, but just to I think I described it as locked and loaded. Just so quickly, it just rolled off his tongue. I can't tell if you're sloppy or mischievous. I can't tell if you're Black or female. and just like how much they map onto the stereotypes. And so that kind of just spoke to the fugitivity, I guess, of just, I'm always on the run. I'm always unsafe. If I show up in my fullness.
Right,
that's why
right.
for so long, I just cut off, I was in, if I was in they call them multi-ethnic church spaces, like these multi-ethnic church conferences. I used to speak at a bunch of those, and I was always the only woman on the main stage. And then I would be in these like women's spaces. They weren't exactly called feminist because they're Christian, but like these like, he's like, we believe that like, I don't know. They believe in like egalitarianism or something. I don't even know what that is, but like, men and women should be equal in the marriage or whatever. So I was in those spaces, but I had to leave my blackness at the table or at the door. And so like, no matter what, I was always cutting off a part of myself. And I think being in France and seeing these Black Madonnas, and particularly that story of being almost arrested, made it so concrete. If I'm both Black and female,
I was going to say, so you could be one or the other, right?
I could be one or the other,
and be relatively safe. Still not completely, but to be both was to really run the risk of being completely at risk, right?
Yeah, There's something about that intersection.
Yeah, and within the white community, specifically white female community, white males too. I guess I shouldn't say just white females, but all we have to do is say that we feel unsafe when you get to the point where we feel like you've overstepped your bounds.
Oh,
you
totally.
You've spoken out of turn. You seem angry. So now all I have to do as a white middle-aged person is say, hey, hold on. This is no longer a safe space for me.
Yeah, it's like white tears. Yeah.
And so our white fragility just is blaring at that point, right? And so it's just straight bullshit. I don't know how else to say it. When we can say whatever the hell we want whenever we want, we can be as angry as we want, and we are, because it's a righteous anger handed down to us by our white male God, right? So we are the conduit of this higher power that gives us permission to speak this way. And when anyone ever contradicts that and says, hold on, this isn't cool, then all we have to do is like, hold on, I no longer feel safe. And it's sad. It's sad that I'm almost 52 years old and just now realizing this. That's what's sad, is that I've lived in this world for 52 years and just now come to realize how easy my life is and how easy I've fallen into the trap that my life is hard.
Yeah, it's true. So let me ask you this question real quick before. So the election of Donald Trump, I know for a lot of folks was, I don't know, it almost signaled the end, didn't it? In some senses, it felt like kind of like you were explaining in the beginning, like, okay, certainly he'd say something that would offend somebody. And it seemed like at every turn, it didn't matter how deep the hole was. He dug the right-wing evangelical church was there to apologize, to explain. But do you feel like Donald Trump's loss 4 years later, like anything's changed? From my perspective, it doesn't seem like a damn thing has changed, but I want your perspective.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think Trump, it was just initially scary because he just brought so much to the surface. Yeah. Particularly in these worlds where I was still trying to make a difference. I was still trying to do reconciliation and help. I think with Trayvon Martin, and then I wrote a book. My book came out the next year that was really about like non-conscious bias in churches. And I think when Trayvon Martin happened, my first thought was people just don't know. They just don't understand how bias works. They just don't, like, they want to do better. They want to release their power. They just don't know how to. And then I went and did several hundred speaking engagements around the evangelical church, explaining to all these people. And over that time, I realized, and some people were honest enough to say, Christina, I hear you. I understand you. I see how you're even pointing to like Philippians 3 or where Jesus emptied himself, and stuff like that. And I just didn't know, I'm not going to do it. I know exactly what you're asking me to do. And the answer is no. And I actually appreciated those people because at least
they were honest.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think what Trump just felt like the final nail in that coffin, because I was already dying. I mean, when I wrote an article for Christianity Today magazine about how Jesus wasn't white, and I just got tons of death threats, like, this is not a group of people who are interested at all in anything spiritually of interest. Or maybe they don't have the tools, right? I mean, it could be that they don't have the tools, but either way, it was a willful ignorance at that point to me, because there was so much national conversation happening that people could just lean into if they wanted to, and they were just choosing not to. So, but yeah, no, I don't think anything's different now.
No, and I mean, from where I sit, it seems like in some ways it's worse. I really feel like the white evangelical church is fixing to double, triple, or quadruple down the next time around.
Oh yeah,
because they haven't learned anything. They don't want to learn anything, and they feel still empowered and emboldened by what they've gotten away with for the last several years. That Trump is an easy scapegoat. I think he's in some ways a very horrifying human being, but he's symptomatic of a larger problem, right?
He
can walk off the face of the earth tomorrow, and his legacy will continue, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah.
So I know there's a lot of sense, because this may be a really weird and maybe a tenuous parallel to draw, but I feel like a lot of white folks are looking for any one thing they do that can undo a whole bunch of bad things they've done. And so ousting Donald Trump felt like a cathartic release to some extent, much the same way that convicting one bad cop of shooting an unarmed black man seems to make up for Trayvon Martin and the other however many hundreds have gone before. Well, look, we did this time. In the most egregious case possible, you still had to fight for a conviction. You still had to fight, to get any kind of even remote sense of justice for somebody. And we all go to patting ourselves on the back and look how far we've come. So I don't know. I'm pessimistic, I guess, and not usually by nature, but in this arena, I tend to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I'm so disconnected from that world now. Like, I used to be like, I remember reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. I think I read it as an adult. I'm sure I read it when I was younger, but I read it as an adult, I think in 2014. And I just remember he talks about being a mascot. And I was like, that's what I am. I'm a mascot. Yeah. I mean, I'm saying it, I'm laughing now, but it was this like horrifying realization in the moment, because I was a mascot in all those spaces. I mean, like every big platform in evangelical Christianity I was on. I was their token black person. And because I had the credentials, because I have the resume of a white man, they were able to easily accept me. And because I'm light skinned, because I'm like cute to them and all these things, and I'm not fat, and just, I mean, there's so many ways in which I was contorted into this picture of like the one black person, the one black woman that they could stomach. And so I was in all those spaces, and now I'm so disconnected from them that I don't even remember like.
But even in those situations, did they listen? Did they listen to you? I mean, or were you just invited, and was that enough to make them feel good about themselves? Yeah,
I mean, I think that there's this really gross. It's like their way of doing penance. It's like this. It's this Protestant penance, where they bring you in once a year, and there are actually lots of black speakers who this is how they make a living. They go back to the same places every single year. They make the white people cry and feel kind of bad. The white people write a check. And then they don't change anything in their organization. And then they bring them back the next year. And it's usually that, like, I called it Premium Black Month from like MLK to the end of February, So like, because that's when everybody wants you to come and they're going to do their penance thing and blah, 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 And I would go once and then just be like, I'm never coming back. Yeah. Because I'm not interested in doing that. But I know people who go to the same places every year, and that's how they make their $120,000 for the year. And it's like so cynical, because I mean, I think at first I was like, oh, these people are going to listen. But then once you're in the real meetings with the boards, you know, because I did so many board retreats with evangelical college trustees. I did a board retreat with Campus Crusade. I did a board retreat with Young Life, like all these huge organizations. And when you're in there with those like old white guys who are literally never going to change, you're just like, yeah, this is
just a bunch of self-congratulatory bullshit, right? I mean,
yeah. I remember last summer, or was it 2020? Yeah, 2020, some like queer young ex-Young Life kids decided to do like a hashtag Do Better Young Life campaign to try to get Young Life to become open and affirming. And they knew that I was like, I know. It's like, oh, it's so cute. It's never going to happen. But because Young Life is all about money and the donors are never going to, you know, right? So, but they contacted me because they know that I have like just like almost every senior vice president in my phone, you know, because I've spoken with I've done so much work with them. And they were like, will you be our spokesperson and take our demands to the board? I was like, no. Because your whole premise, I disagree with. Young Life cannot and will not do better. Like, I've already told Young Life what they can do. I literally told them, they're like, what can we do? What can we do? And I'm like, give all your land back to Indigenous people.
Okay, well, we're done talking at that point.
All these properties you have, give those back to the Indigenous communities and give all your money away to Black trans people. That's exactly what you can do. And they were like, yeah.
Okay, so, but short of that, what else could we do that would maybe be symbolic
is there like a prayer we can do?
Yeah.
Or
could we write a smaller check?
Yeah, or can we hire someone who's completely incompetent to be our diversity and equity person?
Oh, sweet Jesus!
which is what they ended up doing.
Do you ever wonder if it's just ceased to be useful or practical to try to fight and be even represented in those spaces?
Like, yeah, I mean, first of all, those folks don't invite me back.
No, but even if they did, I mean, does it make sense to try?
No, I mean, not for me, because one of the things that this journey has taught me, as I've like through connecting with the Black Madonna, through connecting with my sacredness, and finally seeing myself in the divine, my answer to almost everything is I'm too sacred for that.
I love it. That's good.
And I'm so much more clear on who I am and what I can do, that if an organization can't be a partner in that, then I just am like, well, I'm too sacred for that. Like, try to find somebody else. Cause I have so many gifts. And there are real people who want to do the work.
Yeah.
And so why not just be with those people?
Yeah. I mean, there's bound to be somebody who's actually interested in making the changes and who are really willing to do the digging and the hard work there
absolutely are. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was in a space like that 2 weeks ago with the community in Connecticut, and and so it's just so I don't even bother. But I also know too, like, it's so funny because Nat, you said that you're a pastor, and John, you said that you're kind of like the one throwing bombs at the church. You know?
Yeah.
And I feel like that's more my calling. Like, I'm like 100% prophet, truth teller. And like, there is not a pastoral bone in my body. There just isn't. Like, I don't want to hear your sad story about what happened this week. Like, I don't want to tell you that like Jesus loves you anyway. Like, that's not interesting to me. I think that's a valuable role, but I have some pastoral muscles I've created. I've developed because I do teaching work, and you have to be able to be present to people, but that does not come naturally for me, and it's exhausting. Whereas like that truth telling piece, like once I actually claimed that and just said, yeah, I'm like never going to be, if the female prophets in the Old Testament had actually been documented, then I would be like them, just living out in the wilderness, coming in every once in a while to drop some bombs, but kind of having a love-hate relationship with any institution. I don't do any institutions. I quit my job as a professor. I got divorced in less than 2 years. I don't do the institution of marriage. I don't do the institution of church. Like, I just don't do institutions. It's not personal. It's not personal, but like, I have to be free to be out in the wilderness doing my thing. And that's part of the reason why I don't say yes to those speaking engagements now too, is just like, I'm not your guy.
Yeah. Well, and sadly though, the role of pastor has morphed. I really think a pastor should be working in the prophetic. And I mean that not in the, not in the foretelling the future, type of, but more in just the truth telling part. And too many of those guys, and I've been one, so I can speak to this, too many of them are concerned about offending the donors who keep their religious institutions afloat. And so they withhold some of that truth.
Yeah.
And I'm like, so I know pastors, I have friends who I know are LGBTQ affirming. They don't have an issue with any of that. They could not say that from their pulpits unless they wouldn't have a church anymore. I'm like, say it anyway. Say it anyway. It needs to die. If that's, if whatever role or whatever piece of security you have is coming from withholding truth from people and keeping other people in bondage as a result, by the way, then that thing's corrupt.
We're already dead anyway.
Yeah, let it go, man. What's the worst they can do to you? Take your paycheck? Okay, we can all make money. We'll figure out how to do it. So yeah, I'm not aware. That's really the reason that when I say I pastor a church, it's a very small church, and partly because I don't bother to mince words with people. I say what I think, and I think what I say. And if you're along for the ride, great. But we're not exactly raking them in, because that's some of the truths are difficult to handle.
Yeah. That said, I think and I hear you. And also my ex is a pastor, and he's a wonderful pastor. And I learned so much about how important pastoring is from him. And he was someone who would preach truth, but also he would just be like, this Sunday, people just need to hear about the compassion of God. And I'm the person who's like, no, they don't. They need to get it together. You know what I mean? And so that's where I'm like, no, he's right. They do need that, and it's important, especially for day in and day out community. Yeah. So yeah, finding that balance.
But sometimes you do need to say, yeah, come on, get your shit together, people. Come on.
Totally. And he would do that. And he would do that too. I thought he did a pretty good mix of it, but there were definitely aspects of his ministry that I was just like, yeah, that's exhausting.
Well, it's, it doesn't just become, it's just manipulative. And that's my issue with it is, I can, if I can get up in front of people and I can manipulate their feelings.
Yeah. A lot of it is manipulative.
Right. Mm-hmm. And make them feel bad about how horrible of a human being they are. And then remind them that the church is the place that can save them. But if the doors are closed, there's no place for you to come and be healed. So, make sure you give, and give. And that's the part that one of the parts. I have many parts of the church that I have problems with. But the biggest one is how manipulative it is, and how manipulative it is towards its own salvation and goals.
And also how, I think as I've tried to decolonize my own relationship to spiritual authority and spiritual leadership through my journey, I realized, the church really didn't give me any tools on how to curate spiritual spaces where people can be their own priest. And so now I'm creating these communities, and right now, there are a bunch of people who are doing a virtual Black Madonna pilgrimage with me. And the whole goal is for them to find their truth, for them to have their experience, whatever that is. But we've all been conditioned to show up and have me tell them what the truth is and what they should be experiencing. And so I'm really I'm thinking a lot about what does it mean to be a spiritual leader, because any sort of spiritual leadership just means that people trust you. And so sometimes that trust is conferred, and even if you haven't asked for it. If you sit down, I imagine both of you had this experience as former pastor, sit down on a plane and say, I'm a minister, and people just start telling you all this random stuff. And you're like, so that's a spiritual leadership moment, because they have conferred trust on you, even though you didn't ask for it. And so,
I don't deserve it, so don't do it. So.
Yeah, right. But it's it's interesting, because I think when people who are interested in being along on co-journeying with me are scared. They're lonely. They've left spaces that were their home. They're spiritually homeless now. They've probably alienated a lot of friends and family members. This might be impacting their bottom line in terms of our capitalistic society, and they're not sure if they're going to be able to keep their job, where they have to sign some statement of faith or whatever, you know what I mean, in order to keep their job. And they have no idea what to believe because they have never been taught. They've never been taught how to be curious and present to uncertainty in the spiritual life.
Ooh, that's true.
People don't have any skills for that. So then they show up and then all of a sudden people are like, you're like my living ancestor. And I'm like, whoa, like, no,
I'm not that.
Like, what is happening? You know? And so then you have all this power and this expectation that you're going to fulfill that power. And so then helping people see actually the power is in you. And when everything in them is like, no, it's not, no, it's not, no, it's not. And so it's like that. I'm trying to think of ways, because I know in my journey, I eventually got to a point where I was just like, I'm sacred too. And like, but that was years and years and years of deconstructing. I mean, the first verse I learned, I think we took this story out of my book, but like when I was 3 years old, my mom taught us our first Bible verse. It was Jeremiah 17:9.
Yikes. How did I know that?
The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? That's the first verse I learned when I was 3, because my mom was like, you are evil.
Right. At your core, right? At your
core. And the only way that you can have any salvation is if you obey us, because we represent God. And so like getting that message when I was 3, where my little brain was forming, and taking 30 years to deconstruct that. And even that, you know, and that's why I'm in this like therapy when I'm 35, being like, my dad's saying that the only way to have financial success through God is to sign up for this multi-level marketing scheme. You know, it's like so then it helps me understand why these people come to my programs and they're just like, tell me what to believe. Tell me what is true. And I'm like, it's all about experience. Like, what are you feeling right now? You know, and they're just like, I paid hard money. I want answers.
Tell me how to do this, right?
Like,
well, because you brought that up early on in the conversation where you talked about like just this inability to trust our own intuition, right? And actually, it's not even an inability that's been taken from us, because we were told from the very, very beginning. That's the same verse that John was told. It's the same verse I was told. It was the same one that was pounded into us as a way to demonstrate that we could not trust ourselves. We needed that authority figure, and it's a misuse and abuse of Scripture. It's not even properly translated, but you can get into all that some other day. But the Septuagint does not translate that verse that way. It actually says that that the heart is deep and complex. It's a mystery. Who could know it? That's way different than desperately wicked. Yeah,
I'm desperately wicked, right?
I could go with deep and mysterious. Yeah, I could buy that. But that's one of those things that I think as you start to chart a path forward, and I think you're in a unique position to do this, is to help people reconnect with their own sacredness, to connect with their own sense of intuition, and then learn how to trust that. And I don't exactly know mechanically how that works, but that has got to be the place we land at some point, don't you think? Where we learn to trust that inner voice of our own and stop looking for all the exterior validation of everything, or someone to just tell us what to think or what to feel, right?
Yeah, and I think getting comfortable with uncertainty, getting uncomfortable with saying like, I don't know what I believe, I don't know what I think, I don't know what I feel, I don't know where I'm going, I don't know who my people are, you know.
It was, that was like one of the scariest steps for me, was to say, I no longer know where I'm headed, but that seems like the right path. But, you know, the white evangelical fundamentalist church has taken all of the mystical out of our faith, has taken all of the, you know, they like to call it the woo-woo-ness or whatever you want to call it, right? Of this, but that's what all of our faith is based in, is this mystical idea of a connection to the divine. And it's a process that it's hard, but you know, people like you and the book that you've written, it's so amazing to see, and that we can potentially reconnect with that side. And unfortunately, there's too many people telling you that is not the path and that's not the way towards the divine. And that's just sad. I mean, it's really sad.
Yeah. I think one of the things that was really helpful for me was, it was like reading divine feminine spirituality, because the rubric is so different than the sort of patriarchal belief is what matters. And so in sort of divine feminine spirituality, you're going in the right direction if your love for yourself, for others, and the divine is expanding. That's what it means to be on the right path. Although that language isn't even really used, because the right path is such a linear patriarchal way of looking at anything. But I love that. And I also think I'm really grateful that I got a chance to obviously go on my journey, but I got a chance to write the book with Harper, because I think I have the right personality for this kind of thing. And I think a lot of people just don't have, I'm so wild. I'm so adventurous. I'm totally the person who will just go to France without speaking the language, without knowing anybody, and just like, let's just figure it out. Don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight, but we'll figure it out. Like, that's totally my personality. I'm very like, I can easily take risks that other people really struggle with, because I think a lot of people do need to see that someone else has been down that path. And I think that's where what I hope for in my book is not that everyone goes and becomes devoted to the Black Madonna. I don't really care. I think she's the bomb, and she has taught me that I'm sacred and that I really don't have to give a fuck about what anybody else is telling me to do. And that's huge for me as a goody Christian pastor's kid. But the whole point is like, find your sacred. You can find your sacred, regardless of what anybody has told you, even if you don't feel like you have the tools, even if they've literally handicapped you intentionally so that you would stay back and be afraid. Like, we all have the capacity to do it. And I think sometimes reading other people's stories emboldens us to be like, okay, I can start to ask some of those questions, or whatever my questions are. Yeah.
I could definitely say that a book like yours, well, it's obviously it's engaging, but it's disarming as well. And I think there's a bit of that's necessary to help folks maybe deal with some of the more difficult truths. So some of that disarming personality comes out and helps. A little bit of sugar helps. A spoonful of sugar. But also, I think I'm really, from my perspective, I'm impressed with how many of these voices, either they've always been there and just haven't been aware, or there's just more of them. But John and I've had some fantastic conversations with people like you who have important things to say to people like us as well. I know we're not your target audience, but I think for those of us who are interested in whatever way, shape, or form we can be along with y'all on any kind of journey like this, man, we want to be equipped as well. And some of that just has to be becoming familiar with your stories. And wrapping our heads around things that are so, they're just different from our experiences, right?
Yeah. And I've talked with a few seminary professors at really progressive seminaries who are like, I'm going to be signing your book because my students need to know what theological imagination actually looks like. Like, we talk about it theoretically, but your book is theological imagination, and people need to know, but people need to know that they can bring their self to their interpretation of what's happening spiritually. And I feel like I got emboldened by reading like Palestinian liberation theology. When I read Naeem Atik and he was like, yeah, Samson was the first suicide bomber. I was like, what? Like, we can do anything with scripture,
I do like man.
That's so awesome, right? Like, how to humanize suicide bombers. Well, Samson was one of, you know what I mean? Like, it's so sacred, that work that he's doing. But then it also gives me the guts to then say, well, then I'm going to go back and look at this and see, how does it land on my Black female body? Okay, well, how it lands on my Black female body is what the truth is. So students need to be reading. We definitely did not teach Naeem Atik or any Palestinian liberation theologians that I'm aware of. So usually people don't get that in seminary.
And they should, right? I mean, this is what we hope for in some sort of, some institution. But sadly, even institutions. Never mind. I answered my own question. Never mind.
Institutions, right? Yeah. When I was a kid, I just remember, like, I was telling my colleagues, I was like, I feel like we're doing a great job preparing the next great bishops of 1973. You know, like, it's just like everything we're doing is so irrelevant. You know,
Right.
like so irrelevant.
But if you could go into a time machine and go back, you would be so edgy. So right there.
Yeah, right? I mean, it's just like, oh my gosh, what a waste of time.
Wow. As much as it pains me, it is time for me to go. So I sadly have to. I have so enjoyed this conversation, and I don't think we're anywhere near the end of it. But your book is amazing. If you guys have not had a chance to go out and buy this, please do. We obviously encourage people all the time, support the authors and the writers that we have on the program. If you can, if it's possible, buy it at a local bookstore. If not, I guess you can throw your money at Jeff Bezos. He could use a little more. But I'm sure that Christena has social media platforms she's on.
Yeah. Well, actually, yeah. I mean, I kind of just quit social media because
it's probably smart.
It's just bad for my mental health. But I have a Patreon, and I have a free newsletter that people can sign up for too.
Awesome.
But if you're white, you should really sign up for my Patreon.
Okay, happening today. I'll take care of that.
Yeah.
But no, it's just like we said, John and I are just always super, super. Can I say the word super one more time, John? We're super, super, super. I'm always a little just flabbergasted when people agree to be on the show because who are we? But so we're so honored to have people of your caliber on the program and to have a chance to talk about the stuff that's important to you. And we just appreciate you so much.
Thanks. It's so fun to connect.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.